You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I'm Michael Halcomb and I'm here with Dr. Andy Miller. This is actually our third time trying to get recording. We've been experiencing some technical difficulties, but I'm looking forward to an actual conversation that works. So I want to share with you that Dr. Miller, he's the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Wesley Biblical Seminary and Professor of Preaching and Theology at Wesley Biblical Seminary. I don't know, man, saying Wesley, it seems to take a little bit more effort than just Wesley.
I'm sorry to put that in your, see, on one of our outtakes, I said, Michael, the thing is, it's not Wesley Biblical Seminary, it's Wesley, John Wesley. But I'll tell you, when I was in England, I see a lot of people, they pronounce it Wesley, but we are firmly at WBS. We are on the Wesley camp.
Oh, that's funny.
Do what you need to do, my man. Do what you need to do.
I'll tell you what we should do. We should find another thing that we can try to divide over and argue. So now you got me as a linguist. I'm all paranoid about it. So,
bless your heart. Sorry.
So anyways, it's good to have you on the podcast, brother. And previously I was asking you to just say a word about the seminary. So yeah, let's do that again.
I'm glad to do it. Yeah, this is an exciting moment in the Methodist movement. And I say that not being connected, even though I've just indicated my tribal connections with the way I pronounce one person's name in history. But that's not who I am, and that's not who WBS is. But when we use the word Methodist, we think of it in a very broad way, not just even people, denominations that include Methodist in their title. Association, Independent Methodist, Evangelical Methodist, Free Methodist, United Methodist, Global Methodist, African Methodist Episcopal. I'm not even thinking about that. I'm thinking about the broad tradition that sees its historical grandfather, so to speak, to be John Wesley in the Evangelical Revival of 19th century. 18th century. And with that, the reason I care about that is not because I just care about the 18th century Methodist Evangelical Revival. Like, that's not what I'm instead. Like, I think it's a recovery of what John Wesley called primitive Christianity. I think it's biblical Christianity. And so as a result of that, this is an exciting moment in that movement, because there have been movements away from the faith once for all delivered to the saints. And that's expressed most certainly through the recent General Conference of the United Methodist Church. So WBS was founded kind of apart from United Methodism, and as such, never was given approval by the University Senate, the body that approves seminaries. And so we never could train United Methodist ministers like with an MDiv to go into United Methodist ministry. We provided MDivs, and people would come to us for 2 years and be transferred to another school so that they could serve in their given conference. But what's happened is we've emphasized the authority of Scripture, and we use the word inerrancy to describe that. We say we're enthusiastic inerrantists. Glad to talk about that if you want at some point. Yeah. But also, the reason we emphasize that is we also emphasize the doctrine of entire sanctification. Well, it's in part this conservative approach has led us to not be accepted in broad United Methodism. So now we get this moment where there needs to be clarity, and the Global Methodist Church and other groups are coming to us because they're looking for a group that emphasizes, an institution that institutes what we emphasize. And so it's been an exciting moment. We, in the last year, have added more than 300 students from the Global Methodist Church. We have close to 500 students. We have, we have 600 alumni, and we have 500 students. So this is a wild time for WBS.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. It's exciting to hear. In spite of all the stuff going on in United Methodism, it's exciting to hear for the seminary. So, congratulations on that. And what are the schools that have been recognized by the GMC? Do you know?
Yeah, so we were one of the first 6 schools to be, I forget the word they used. It wasn't necessarily recommended. They used the word recommended. So they're changing the way, at least initially, the way they function with higher education, not requiring an MDiv or even a master's degree, but encouraging recommended schools. I would love to see them move towards approved schools because there are some schools that come along that come from a different tradition, and they might have one Wesleyan faculty member, or a couple, and maybe teach a Wesleyan polity class, Wesleyan theology. But I think as Methodists in that tradition, I would love for them. And I've moved my ordination to the Global Methodist Church, so I'm a part of it myself. So, anyways, it's there are 6 schools that were initially approved, and then we were the first school approved with a course of study for students who weren't seeking a master's degree.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this because I was looking back over your website. Yesterday I think it was. I got it pulled up right now, and I know you have a history with the Salvation Army.
Yeah.
So for me, my knowledge of the Salvation Army is pretty minimal. Although I went to Asbury Seminary and I knew other folks who were sort of, involved in that. But tell me a little bit about the Salvation Army. And then I don't know if you're at liberty to talk about why you shifted your ordination, but that'd be interesting to hear as well.
Yeah, for sure. Depends on how long you have. I'm glad to talk about it for a long. So I'll finish my PhD dissertation. Actually, I've completed my last chapter. Need to write a conclusion and put everything together in the next few months. But on William Booth's, the founder of Salvation Army, his ecclesiology. So it's all very fresh right now, as you know, Michael. I ask you a question about Revelation, and I'm sure we'll get a nice long answer. So most people, you're in most evangelicals, most people in the world, and particularly in the United States, don't understand the ecclesial dimensions of the Salvation Army. So William Booth was saved in a Methodist context, and he served in a couple of different Methodist split off groups. Of course, one of the things that's important to note, even about this period that we're experiencing in broad Methodism, is that we're all dealing with the fact that John Wesley never separated from the Church of England. Like, he was a Church of England man until he died. But yet he still took some actions that were distinct, and that in 1784, he ordained Thomas Coke and several other people at the same time, who then in turn ordained Francis Asbury, and then eventually they called themselves bishops. And we had the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States. And then not long after John Wesley dies, there's several official acts where the Wesleyan Methodists separate and become their own denomination. Then there are other splits that come and see problems within Wesleyan Methodism. So William Booth emerged in a period where there was disunity amongst Methodists, and he felt led to preach to the masses. And the system that he was in was called the Methodist New Connection, wasn't willing to give him the autonomy to be able to go out and be an itinerant evangelist. And so he broke off from them and became an itinerant evangelist. And then 4 years later, came to the East End of London and found the biggest collection in England of the masses. And so he decided to camp out there and started what was then called the East London Revivalist Association. And he was connected to the 1859 revival, Holiness Revival. And eventually that it took on different names, and eventually a Christian Mission. And then 13 years later became the Salvation Army. And he had a distinct polity. Now, in that period, he didn't want to appear to be a sect. He didn't want to appear to be breaking off. But from the very beginning, there was this clear moment where he said, all right, we exist for these reasons. And he repeated this 4 or 5 times in his life, at least, probably more, but at least they're written. He said, first, our converts won't go where they're sent. Second, they're not wanted. And then third, he said, I wanted some of them myself. So he said, at that point, I wanted some of them myself. I wanted them myself and helping bring others to Jesus. And it was a purely kind of evangelistic task that he had. So even though he had adopted a polity, a doctrine, and it was very similar to Methodist movements of his time, he claimed he wasn't starting a new sect or denomination, but he started a sect or denomination, right? It just clearly was. They were baptizing people. They were creating environments for discipleship, for people to come in. They had buildings, they had weddings, they had funerals. And then when it comes to Salvation Army, they just militarized the whole thing. And he felt like what made him distinct from Methodism was his polity. And so he refused to call himself a church. Instead, he called it an army. And in that system, then he was the autocratic head, and he was glad to have that term. He even called himself, joked around with the title Pope. Okay, all of that to say, like, that's part of the confused understanding of what it meant for the Salvation Army to be a church. Then in 1890, he starts a more aggressive campaign to eliminate poverty, homelessness, and the like in a plan called In Darkest England. And then that becomes a prominent feature that gives him notoriety all throughout the world. By the time he dies, he's in 50 countries in 1912, more than 50 countries. But this Darkest England scheme, as he called it, became prominent. And the public, even to this day, primarily recognizes that work as opposed to the ecclesial foundation of the Salvation Army. But yet still this military system of ranks, of uniforms, brass bands is still a part of the heartbeat of the Salvation Army. So it's all run by those who are in ecclesial leadership. And so that's led to, in the United States, Salvation Army being known as a charity as opposed to being known as a church.
Interesting. And so what led to moving the ordination from Salvation Army to...
Oh, for me personally, yeah.
Yeah, for you personally. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'd like to, yeah. So I was, so it's a very closed system, even though it's an evangelistic system. And I was a 6th generation Salvation Army officer. And this was, so my family goes all the way back to the founding of the Salvation Army in the 19th century in England. And so through my grandfather, my paternal grandfather's family, came to the United States through the ministry of the Salvation Army. So it's a whole world. It's a whole social world. So I was ordained in the Salvation Army and served for 15 years in 3 different locations. My last appointment was in Tampa, Florida, where I was an area commander responsible for a few Salvation Army units, and then the pastor of one of those Salvation Army churches, where I had responsibilities for boards and fundraising, capital campaigns, and homeless shelters, rehab programs, and then also pastoring a 150, 200 member church. So oddly, the Salvation Army doesn't necessarily encourage higher education. I think they're glad for people to have a college degree, but people don't go to seminary. But I felt a clear calling to go to Asbury Theological Seminary, in part because my wife was a year and a half behind me in school. And I just loved learning about theology. And the education for Salvation Army officers is at an undergraduate level at best. And I didn't actually feel called to be a Salvation Army officer at that time. But then God led us to think that would be the best use of our gifts. So served for 15 years, and I got a DMIT, and I started my PhD a few years after that. And I began to see that the same thing I talked about earlier, this broad pan-Wesleyan Methodist movement, that it was my little section of it, the Salvation Army, which has 1 million members across the world, was very not restrictive, but there was more. There was just more people to serve, and there was more opportunities. And I saw that when I preached at a camp meeting, Indian Springs Holiness Camp meeting, and there I interacted with Tim Tennant, who is president of Asbury Seminary. He encouraged me to pursue a PhD and to maybe consider that there could be other opportunities outside the Salvation Army. He didn't push me too hard, but he just said this might be, there might be other avenues of service. And I was offered this job that I'm in by the president of WBS at the time, and I turned him down right away. I just, on the phone, I didn't even think about it. I just said, no, I'm in the Salvation Army. It's not what I'm going to do. And then 2 weeks later, my wife and I are sitting down and we realized, we didn't even pray about it. It just, I was so ingrained in the Salvation Army that I just couldn't even conceive of myself operating outside of it. And I felt like that's where God wanted me. And over a couple months of just considering the option, we took job. We stayed in the Salvation Army as our church. I had to give up my ordination of sorts when I left the appointment system of the Salvation Army. We attended a Salvation Army church for a while, but this Salvation Army church at the time didn't have any programs for our kids, and it wasn't a healthy environment for our family. And so we went to a church that disaffiliated, and I wanted a place to recognize my ordination. The GMC was glad to do that. And I'm also really passionate about this movement, and I'm excited for what the GMC can be. And I think the Salvation Army has gradually become less of a church, not less than a church, but it's doesn't emphasize its ecclesial foundations. And ultimately, I'm interested in the church. I want to serve the church. And that's why I'm in seminary education, is I'm passionate about the church.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. So we're seeing, are you seeing, you're talking about there's a lack of emphasis on sort of the ecclesial foundations, and I'm assuming with that, a lack of emphasis on focus on doctrine and theology and good biblical interpretation, handling the text responsibly.
Right.
That would seem to just come with that. Are you seeing a movement toward like the liberalization of the Salvation Army? Is that taking place?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, there's a connection there. And I think there is actually a hermeneutical approach there's a dissertation probably that needs to be written on the Salvation Army's hermeneutical perspective. There's actually a very rich tradition of interpretation within the Army. It's not academic, it's practical, but it's also been generally orthodox. But there hasn't emphasized. I mean, some people would say, well, any denomination that emphasizes an MDiv, that's their death knell, right? So, like, it certainly hasn't helped. Like, and so I don't. That's a fear for the Salvation. So, like, one famous person who came to the Salvation Army with education was a man named Samuel Logan Brengle, and William Booth said that he was from the dangerous classes, right? So, like, very cautious, and yet, like, in part, they were so successful that they had a reason to think that God was at work amongst them. So that tradition has been a part of what the Salvation Army is, very prophetic in its calls to William Booth's, I think the clearest doctrine he had was his belief in hell. Like, he really believed people were going to hell and that God wanted to use him in the army to save people from hell. And so they spoke out against things like prohibition. They spoke on favor of prohibition, and very political in those days. But what's happened is, as the Salvation Army has become bigger, and particularly on the receiving funding from the community and from the government, it's led that prophetic biblical edge to be gone. Now, they would never say that explicitly, but if you look at their website, it's not emphasizing, or any public presentation generally doesn't emphasize the theological or ecclesial dimensions of the Salvation Army. And I grew up in this rich heritage of a hymnology and a theological perspective on sanctification, and kind of this evangelical Wesleyanism that was very rich. But I've just seen that decline. And what's happened is, certainly within the Salvation Army, there's no arguing about the fact that a liberal theology is expressing itself. Now, whether that is a dominant group or not, I don't know. But the Salvation Army isn't explicitly pushing down or distancing itself from the liberalizing groups on human sexuality within its ranks. And there's no discipline there. There's a lack of discipline. And I'm afraid, the anti-intellectual streak is not helping the Salvation Army respond in this moment.
Interesting. So you're in the GMC now. They've recognized several seminaries. Your comment a moment ago was very striking about the MDiv being sort of the death knell. Um, uh, I'm curious, what is the GMC doing in that regard? Is it requiring an MDiv? Is it, what is the GMC doing? Because I don't know at this point.
Yeah, so they have right now a transitional book of discipline, which is their doctrines and rules. It's actually called Transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline, using the old Methodist idea. That's what they used to be called. And that transitional book doesn't require an MDiv, but it requires an approved seminary to facilitate a course of study of particular subjects. And so, I want to encourage people to get as much education as they can. And it's been a benefit to me. It'd be somewhat hypocritical of me to say, oh, we don't need any education, when it's been such a blessing to my life. And I want people to have that, but I do recognize we can make an idol out of it. And there are as I didn't really have a dog in the fight. I joined the GMC, but I just recognized this transitional book of discipline. And since I didn't have any Methodist students before, we just decided to go with what they had. And so we tailored our program around their description. And then what's happened, we've interacted and we've seen that what had happened in United Methodism is that they had created, maybe unintentionally, a two-tiered system for preachers. And some people who were licensed local preachers serving in more rural locations often were thought of as not quite the same and not treated the same way, not given the same benefits as an elder because of their education. And so in order to become an elder, you would generally have to have an MDiv. As far as I don't know United Methodist Poly that well. So the GMC wanted to eliminate that. And honestly, as I'm working with students across the country, many of them, I can see it's a very wise move. They're very, very capable. They're in a full-time role. They should have the opportunity, and it shouldn't be dependent upon the fact that they don't have a bachelor's degree. Maybe they have a GED and they don't have the money or the time to get an MDiv or even a master's degree, but they can pursue a course of study with us and receive ordination and be a deacon or an elder. And I think those are very biblical terms. And so the GMC doing that, but at the same time, I would love for the GMC to find, and this is a debate within the GMC right now, and I'm willing to listen. I could be wrong on this. Find ways to incentivize people getting MDivs. I still think an MDiv is the best thing to do. If you want to be a pastor, the best thing you could do is get an MDiv. But I just recognize not everybody can do that.
Yeah. I remember when I was working on my master's degree, I think it was either my MDiv or my master's in biblical studies. I remember a gentleman in the church. He actually wasn't so gentle. I remember a man in the church telling me, now, don't you go off to seminary and lose your faith. There was a deep suspicion of, being from whatever, as Booth said, something like the wrong classes or something like that, that's the education system was going to somehow corrupt me. And on the one hand, that was frustrating. On the other hand, especially in hindsight, that man's fears were totally justified. Because we have seen students go off to university or seminary, and when they come back, you don't even recognize them after a semester. So this is interesting, and I'll probably get myself in trouble for saying this because I'm a Nazarene pastor.
Yeah.
But we had a general superintendent come not too long ago, a couple years ago, and was saying, during our district assembly, this person was saying from the front, my kids are going to, college now. And as they were preparing to do that, they were asking, Mom and Dad, where could I go to college? And this general superintendent said, you can go anywhere as long as it has the name Nazarene in it.
Wow.
And I'm sitting in the audience And I have the exact opposite rule for my kids. You can go anywhere as long as it doesn't have the name Nazarene in it.
Wow. Yeah. I've heard that. Yeah.
Our Nazarene institutions have become thoroughly liberalized. And I don't mince words, and I don't hesitate to say names like Point Loma University, which is the region I'm in. Our regional school
right.
is thoroughly liberalized to the point my congregation that I serve in, we stopped sending them any supporting funds years ago. And we've seen students go off to Point Loma. They're on this district. We've seen this. We go off for the freshman year and come back, and suddenly the girl's identifying as a boy. Or they're saying they're gay or bi or something like this. And you spend 18 years discipling your children, and you send them off to a trusted denominational school, and within a year or within a semester they come back and they've become totally liberalized. And so I mean, it is, I even as an academic, as a professor myself, I have great suspicions surrounding sending kids off to university or seminary. And so it is refreshing to hear Wesley Wesley Biblical Seminary standing firm. And even from my alma mater and your alma mater, Asbury, we've seen so many people come out of Asbury, and they've been liberalized. They've swallowed that sort of woke bug, and it's devoured them. And it's been really heartbreaking in the last week just to see classmates that I went to seminary with who are celebrating. I saw a picture of one of my former classmates. He posted on social media about it was a great day to finally serve communion in an inclusive church, and he had the rainbow stole on. And and it's just like, man, this is heartbreaking. And so I get the suspicion about academia.
Yeah. I'm with you. Like I have we shouldn't lump everybody together and say, well, the MDiv's a problem. Well, there is in part where you get your MDiv,
exactly,
where you get your, and also that, but we don't want to say, like, I have a guy who used to drive a milk truck. And when he got on my class, I thought, and he's been a licensed local pastor for a few years, and he's starting to do his course of study work with us. Well, he when he started to talk, I thought, there's no way this guy's going to make it through a master's level class. Like, there's no chance. Like, I just based upon, like, and maybe I was stereotyping him. Oh, I was. Well, it turns out, like, he was better than any. He scored had the highest grade in the whole class. And that's in part, like, if we keep the same system, we're going to say that guy who's been, I don't know how, I'm not sure how long he's been served, 5 or 6 years. We're going to say to him, no, you need to go and get a bachelor's degree, 120 credits, and then 4 years. How much money are you going to spend to do that? You could do it at WBS. Here's my commercial, for $30,000, like, pretty cheap. But then get a master's degree. Okay, maybe it's a 60 credit master's, 2 or 3 more years. 7 years later, $100,000 out of pocket. Now you can be an elder. I don't think that's necessary. At the same time, I do want to say, like, trusted institutions.
Yeah,
I want to emphasize and also that means that I'm calling myself open to this as the dean. I'm saying that the institution, the GMC, the Nazarene Church, the Salvation Army, whoever, can come to me and say, what are you teaching? Yeah. What are you teaching? Like, good. Okay, are you teaching? Do you have like some institutions, they might have somebody outside of the tradition teaching Wesleyan theology, or they might have somebody who doesn't share the same beliefs in general. And so, yeah, you should be able to call me into question, and there should be a process for that. So I want there to be high standard. I want and I think this is where I would emphasize it. And this is maybe different about WBS and other institutions, maybe because we're in a privileged place because we're financially not dependent on everything is advantageous to us at this moment. Well, we want to hear from the church. We want to hear as close as we can to the ground level work, and then we want to respond to the needs of the church. At the same time, we as the Academy, Theological Academy, and where most of our professors have served as full-time pastors, we want to be able to come alongside the church and say, well, you might want to think about this. But ultimately, we want to take our cue from the church, as opposed to sitting in an ivory tower. I know I'm making a straw man case here, like sitting in an ivory tower telling people that, you need to listen to us. Now, I'm not saying, certainly that's happened with the kind of R1 type of schools that were receiving United Methodist funding in the past.
Yeah. Well, there's the old saying, and it isn't, I get that, I've heard the ivory tower thing before, but I think it doesn't go just like ivory tower telling the church what to do. It really, there's another step in there, right?
Amen, yeah.
It's the minister that gets trained.
Yeah.
And so there's that old saying, right? As goes the seminary, so goes the minister. As goes the minister, so goes the church. As goes the church, so goes society.
Yeah.
And so what's happening in our seminaries, they are really, when you get down to it, responsible for what the shape of society looks like in large part. And you look at all the seminaries that have been liberalized and again swallowed the woke pill, and well, it doesn't take long to devastate a church, or an entire denomination, for that matter. I was just doing some research yesterday, and in 2004, Andy, only 2 decades ago, only 40% of Democrat officials supported same-sex civil unions.
Wow.
In 2008, 4 years later, that was only 16 years ago, 50%. So a 10% increase of Democrat officials approved of same-sex civil unions. And get this, in 2008, California voted to ban same-sex civil unions.
Wild. Yeah.
And then by 2012, nearly 100% of Democrat officials approved same-sex civil unions. And of course, today, both Democrat officials across the board in California are known for it. But that shows you like what happened just in a matter of 4, 8, 12, 20 years, right? And our seminaries and Bible colleges largely followed suit.
Or they just didn't say anything, right?
They
didn't take a position. And I think that's part of the problem.
Not taking positions. I mean, really taking a position, right? Being silenced, taking a position. So I mean, the issues of human sexuality, and of course that comes down to Scripture, and how we think about Scripture. And you were talking earlier about how some of our Wesleyan distinctives are entire sanctification, and WBS especially inerrancy.
Sure.
You guys are enthusiastic inerrantists. When I want to circle back to that, when I look at, for instance, our Nazarene institutions of higher education, again, I can't think of a one that I would feel all that confident in sending my kids to, any of my kids to, right?
Maybe Nazarene Bible College.
And that's strictly online these days.
Right.
Which, I'd like my kids to be able to experience.
I gotcha. I feel it.
So Nazarene Bible College, and Scott Sherwood's doing a good job with that. And he's a solid guy. And he often goes around making that promise. You send your kids to us, you'll recognize them when they come back home. He'll say things like, there'll be more Nazarene after, they've come to us than they were before. And so, it's a shame to me that we don't have every Nazarene college president making that kind of claim and making that kind of promise. But they continue stacking, leftists and progressives liberals in very important positions, and it's just disheartening and discouraging. And
Do you think
yeah,
there's a connection with sorry to interrupt you.
no, go.
Do you think there's a connection with unwillingness to affirm inerrancy in this? Now, here's what I think. Here's why. It's because when people are dogmatic about not affirming inerrancy,
Yeah,
okay, here's what's often at the heart of that. I think it's generally social. It's not. If somebody reads the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy and sees the Wesleyans who signed it, you can see like often the claim. I know the Nazarene claim is, oh, that has a Calvinist origin or a Reformed origin. Well, there's nothing Calvinist about this. I mean, show me Calvinism in the Chicago Statement, and it's, yeah, certainly you as a New Testament scholar would maybe, and me as a historian, maybe we come and we would write it a little differently. Certainly, it's 50 years old, 40 years old.
Yeah.
So I get it. Like I get that there may be some things that could be said better, but I think in general it like handles literary context well, and all of the exceptions that people take to inerrancy are kind of covered in that statement. I mean, for me, now here's why I mean this impacts what you're saying is when people say they don't affirm inerrancy, they're trying to say, I believe I don't want to be that strong. I don't want to say something. I don't want to say too much. And I just don't think we can say too much about what we think about God's revelation in space and time.
yeah,
I think God's been perfectly clear that he's without error revealed himself and all that he intends to do. And there's no, the cheap shots at an inerrantist are like, I'm sorry, I just don't think they hold much water. It's like, no, not many inerrantists sound like the way that people. And so but what are you going to do in that case? You're willing to say, I don't really want to take the Bible that seriously. And I think what we say at WBS is we want to use the strongest possible word that God, inerrancy is it right now. Give me a stronger word, Michael, and I'll use it. But what it does is it says, like, we believe God's revealed himself, and he's revealed himself clearly. Now that our interpretation isn't inerrant, like we still need to enter into a hermeneutical process, and we need to be challenged on that. But inerrancy makes me look harder at the text, and calls me to see how the hard passages fit into the big picture of the Bible. So I think there could be a connection to inerrancy and what's happened in institutions.
Yeah, I mean, inerrancy is an interesting thing, right? When you look back at sort of the history of it, especially like with Gordon Conwell and institutions like that, there have been sort of witch hunts associated with that, and I think one reason some people might pull away from the language is part of that. There have been these sort of theological witch hunts going on, and I think I remember hearing I think it was Witherington one time talking about inerrancy dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but
doesn't the existence of God do the same thing?
Doesn't everything, right? So yeah, I mean, so you immediately
don't believe that, by the way. That's why I want to be sure, and I don't get caught in like everything requires words. Like, if we're gonna creation out of nothing, okay, it's not like de facto.
Yeah. No, I agree. So I think part of the issue too is we have to, whenever we talk about inerrancy, is like, what do we mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Because it's almost been this thing like where there are as many views of inerrancy as there are inerrantists almost. That's an overstatement, an exaggeration, but so when I talk about inerrancy, what are we talking about? Like, let's just make sure we're on the same page.
I'm with you.
And also, like, even infallibility language, I don't shrug my shoulders at that or get nervous at that. As long as we know what we're both talking about. And so, but I do think that you're making the connection there. It's really important. And
well, you can even say generically, it's kind of calmed down version to say biblical authority, right? But of course, like and I'm just using the word woke to describe the kind of panoply of progressivism
Yeah.
depending on some Marxist thought and the like. And
Yeah.
so generally, like they would say they believe in the Bible's authority, right? Like they're not going to. But okay, a lower view, you want whatever it takes. If you're going to lower your view of biblical authority, that's where we get to problems.
Yeah, exactly. So like for me, I have no qualms about affirming inerrancy as long as I know what we're talking about.
Yeah, me too.
Different people
Chicago
mean different
State.
things. Yeah, same thing with again, infallibility. I have no issues affirming that as long as I know what we're talking about and how each of us are what we're meaning.
Well, you can do
But
the same thing with the Trinity. So you say, like, I affirm the Trinity. Well, I'm not a tritheist, right? Like, I just say, like, you just think.
yeah.
I had been on my podcast to talk about his new book, Sola Scriptura, and I love the whole book. I think you could call. And if you're listening, I'm glad to talk with you, Brother Witherington. But you know, the whole book might as well be an inerrancy book, except for one page where he says it dies a death of 10,000 qualifications. I mean, and when you do that, it's like everything. It's just not. I just don't feel like that's a good argument. It's basically saying, I don't know what you mean. That's the world.
Yeah, so let's talk about what we mean. Let's define terms, right? Yeah. And in New Testament studies, N.T. Wright, you mentioned him earlier, he said the same thing about the new perspective on Paul. He's like, there isn't a new perspective on Paul. There are as many new perspectives on Paul as there are Pauline scholars, and so in a way, like that's when we talk about infallibility, when we talk about inerrancy, when we talk about authority of Scripture, we always have to define terms, right?
Yeah, that's right.
We got to do that. And so, but I do think you're on to something, that there's an absolutely a connection there, a breakdown for the reverent, like a lack of reverence for Scripture, a lack of respect for Scripture. People, you unhinge that, and the next logical step is why I disagree with Paul. Or you do that whole thing, like John Dominic Crossan, where you pit Paul against Jesus, and then you pit Paul against Luke, and then like you pit Paul against Paul.
That's right.
And you have a theological Paul and a historical Paul.
Yeah,
right?
Gotcha.
And once you do that, then I actually had a district superintendent in the Church of the Nazarene tell me I disagree with Paul.
Yeah,
and I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, like I can't.
Yeah. Well, there's people who say that same type of thing in the Salvation Army, defend women in ministry. I'm like, you have a lot better case to make than just I disagree with Paul. Like, it's just like within Paul, you have a much better case to make. Robert Gagnon's coming to teach for us.
I saw that.
Visiting scholar in residence. He's going to teach a class on sexuality in the Bible. And he I've heard him tell a story like 5 or 6 times now. And he talks about being at a debate at SBL with Bill Loader on in like one of the breakout groups, is like sexuality breakout groups, and LGBTQ, and he was the only person, the whole lineup. And they finally went back and forth, and Loader said to him something like, well, I agree with Dr. Gagnon that Jesus would have been against same-sex activity, same-sex marriage, and the like. It says, I just disagree with Jesus. Like, seriously, like this isn't, like, that's not the right way. And so really dealing with another level. And I thought that I wish that was on video, because I've told that story enough secondhand, but I have never heard anybody say, no, that couldn't have happened. Well, it's absolutely true that there's a disagree with Scripture, disagree with again, like, I think it's the authority of God in the universe, like communicating perfectly and without error all that it intends to communicate.
I agree with that. And with that definition, I have zero qualms. You get into these sticky situations where, like, Jesus is calling the mustard seed the smallest of all possible seeds, right?
For sure.
When botanically speaking, scientifically speaking, it's not. Oh, so Jesus was in error? Well, no, it wasn't in error. There are various ways to explain that. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, if you're gonna like stick with just like strict, botanical lenses,
Yeah.
then you could make a case where he was in error, I guess perhaps. But when you look at the context, it's easy to explain how he wasn't in error, right?
Yeah. Well, if I was to say, I'll see you in an hour, like I'll see you in an hour, and I come 59 minutes. Was I in error?
Right.
No, what was I like intending to do? And like, what was the,
exactly.
These are the type of things that are easily answered in the Chicago Statement, and any person who's thought through inerrancy. I mean, I'll be honest with you, when I came to Wesley Biblical Seminary, I thought I knew for sure because I knew scholars who had been here, John Oswald, Bill Urey, and I just said, when they asked me in the interview, well, it wasn't exactly an interview, but like when they asked me about inerrancy, I said, "Look, like you, what do you mean?" And they said, Chicago Statement. I'm in.
Yeah.
I'm 100%. I'm enthusiastic inerrantist.
Yeah.
That's what you mean. But if you mean six, you have to adopt your interpretation.
Yeah.
Your interpretation is inerrant. No, I'm not going to do that. A 6 day. I have no problem with 6 day. I actually have 6 day creationist friends who I think are very smart and have thought through things. And I'm not there. And I don't know if any of our faculty, I don't think any of our faculty are 6 day creationists. I think we have some adjunct faculty who are, and they've thought through their position. And honestly, one of them stumps me every time I talk to him, but I just can't quite, I just don't go there all the way. And I have no opposition to it. I'm not opposed to it. Exegetically, I'm just not there. But I'm not going to, as long as we're not talking about a perfect interpretation, I'm good.
Absolutely. And I think that's the nub of the issue for some people. I mean, like, and it's been something. So I was interviewing with Gordon Conwell a few years ago. I don't know if I should tell the story. I'm gonna tell it anyways. So I was interviewing. I made it to the third or fourth round of interviews, and I didn't end up getting hired. And in that last round of interviews that I made it to is down to the final 3 candidates, I believe, either 3 or 2. And I was on a call with, I don't know, 6 or 7 faculty from there. And literally every single question they asked me somehow circled back to inerrancy, but particularly with regard to how I would engage Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis. 100% of the questions. One of the questions even was, have you read Pete Enns' new book on Adam and Eve, the historical Adam?
Yeah.
And I just finished, I was finishing up my PhD and said, no, I haven't read that. And so the respondent goes, so you're not up on your game then?
Oh my goodness.
I was like, no, I just finished a PhD. I just finished writing a dissertation, and that's very like laser focused. I haven't had time to read a popular level book on, somebody I might not read anyway. So, but every single question,
okay,
back to that. And I was, I like teaching Greek. I was wanting them to ask me something about, what's your pedagogy? What do you think about middle voice? But every single question was circling back to that. And I found that very frustrating to a degree, but I think what was going on there was exactly what you're saying. Not do you affirm inerrancy, but do you affirm our interpretation, which we think is inerrant.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to beat up on Gordon Conwell there. They do a lot of good stuff, but that was my experience. And I just, that one experience, like, put me in a position to always start asking, okay, well, what are we talking about? Talking about inerrancy, right? Because I think they would have, hearing what you just said about like the 6 day creation, some of them would have definitely raised our eyebrows about that. So I don't know. I mean, let's talk a little bit as we maybe head toward the line here. I want to talk about a couple of your books. I want to get those in front of people. And boy, we could probably talk all day about these two. I'm going to screen share here just so people can see your website and see your book covers. The first one is Contender. We'll circle back to this one in a second.
Okay.
It's a study of Jude.
Yeah.
And then you have Holistic Hospitality. The subtitle is interesting, A Bridge to a Future Army.
Yeah.
Salvation Army, I guess. And then Stay the Course, Challenges to Salvation is from the book of Acts. So you got Jude, you got Acts. Let's talk about this holistic hospitality. What are you doing in this work?
Yeah, so I did my D-Men project with Billy Abraham at Perkins on, a D-Men project needs to have a practical application of like what you can do in your church. And so I was influenced by, you might have had Christine Pohl as well at Asbury Seminary, and just really loved the idea of looking at social ethics as hospitality. And I wanted to come up with a way to, it was my attempt in the Bridge to Future Army, is a way to take and uncouple or social services pragmatic. And so it's primarily a book for the Salvation Army. This has become separated from the ecclesial work of the Salvation Army, the salvation work, so to speak, even though you want to have a broad view of works of mercy and works of piety and like see that as part of the work. But essentially what's happened in the Salvation Army is while there might be a scripture verse on the wall, a lot of the social services is run through government contracts, and is a lot of times there's non-Christians leading the Salvation Army's social service work. And so it's not facilitated in that way. So I wanted to come up with a way, and I felt like the language itself is a part of the problem. So I thought using hospitality, welcome of strangers. I'm not a Greek person, Michael, but I know xenophilos, right? Love of stranger. It was a way to think about this broad tradition of social ethics. So I had a program to try to engage the entirety of the Salvation Army's mission under the framework of hospitality. And my hope was it could bring a holistic connection to an integrating perspective to the Salvation Army.
All right. So this is interesting because I feel like this is another thing that has been sort of hijacked.
Yeah.
By
it's exactly
left.
The word hospitality. Yeah.
Yeah. You hear the word hospitality, and it's almost like code word for affirming.
Yeah.
These days. And so that's not what you're doing here.
No. Yeah. It became more in vogue, like sadly, taken that way. Just like one of the most important, I think if I had to write this again, I would have some chapters on avoiding toxic charity. And with that, it means basically everybody has to do this in some way in social services, having guidelines and boundaries and borders within your hospitality so that you're a healthy person serving. I mean, I have pretty dramatic views about homelessness, and I've seen it at work. I've seen the When Helping Hurts book with toxic charity. I totally affirm that perspective, that when we step in and do things for people that they can't do for themselves, we then are acting paternalistically. And I actually see it when it's known as a sin, like when we step in. And so I would want to balance all that. I think there's not enough of that perspective in there of how to implement it. So people really get vehement with me when I talk about that perspective.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, you got this, you have Stay the Course. And so you're challenging salvationists.
Oh, man. The title that will hurt both these books published by the Salvation Army. So I didn't get to choose the title, subtitle particularly. So it does work for non-salvationists, right?
Okay.
It's maybe you call it devotional commentary through Acts.
Okay.
It's my preaching through Acts. So there are sermons that I converted into a book form, kind of devotional form. So I make it through Acts. I could do some things differently in there now, but I think in general, it has illustrations. It's a type of thing you could use in a study, but it's just an opportunity, like look at various passages and me preaching through Acts.
Gotcha. And then you have the study on
Yeah.
Jude as well.
Yeah. I love Jude, man. This has become my last 3 years. I've just been swimming in those 25 verses. I
Mm.
I love that page of the Bible.
Yeah.
It's just what I found is that Jude gives this clear word to church in our time, because he's speaking to the church in his time, of confronting problems within the church, and particularly related to sexuality. And what I found is like, looking, if I can help people get a little bit into the context of intertestamental literature, I know like the things you kind of live and breathe.
Mm.
It's it really helps them see the Jude's argument. And I love exposing people to some of those sources that are not just in Jude, but of course throughout the New Testament, to see the Enoch and some of the intertestamental traditions, but also this like reality that we don't have to fall. Like we don't have to, like,
Mm.
we have the opportunity to contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. So I love that. Like I enjoyed I've enjoyed teaching it. I've developed 2 courses on my website. One is Contender, and oh yeah, thanks for clicking on it. So then it's a 6-session video sections of walking through Jude and then having discussion questions. And then I have another one on the afterlife where I have 3 sessions on heaven, one on Jesus's descent to the realm of the dead, and then a session on hell.
Mm.
So these are like Sunday school material or small group studies with me sitting at this very spot, teaching through those subjects. So that's part what I had in mind. And it was just easy to take. I actually did this video course first, and then I just took my lectures and converted them to a book.
Mm.
So that's how that came about.
Excellent. And you have you run your podcast, which is more to the story. Lots of great stuff on there. And people can get that on Apple, Spotify, Google, and right here on your website as well. So is it audio and video, or
my YouTube is Andy Miller III, Andy Miller III.
Yeah. Okay.
And I've been emphasizing YouTube more lately, but I've realized that the people who come on and subscribe on audio, they're folks, and that's my old podcast, which when I left the Salvation Army, I changed it to more to the story.
Gotcha. Yeah, some interesting, some really good guests you've had on the podcast there. Yeah, so man, you got a lot of good things going on, and I appreciate you carving out some time to sit down with me. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks for what you guys are doing. I love what you're doing in publishing, and glad for the avenues. Like I know Rick Boyd has his work on Hebrews coming out. I had him on my podcast to talk about that, and he talked you guys up a little bit. And looking forward to all the things you guys are doing.
Yeah, keep us in mind for any future projects you might have.
Yeah.
So, well, people can check out your website at andymillerii.com. Same on the YouTube page. Check out Wesley Biblical Seminary if you get a chance, if you're interested. And check out gloshouse.com, the Gloshouse YouTube page, the Proof Text podcast, all that good stuff. We'll stop there, our friends, and say, I hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Gloshouse can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Gloshouse offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to gloshouse.com today. Gloshouse, language resources for the global community.